Nadia Furlong knelt in the frost of her yard, stacking cold fire bricks into a low wall that went nowhere. Each one curved slightly, refusing to sit flush against its neighbor. She wedged pebbles into the gaps, cursing softly, her breath clouding. Behind her, the rented workshop leaned under a sagging gutter she couldn't afford to fix. She had $1,100, a dead man's masonry handbook, and a stubborn certainty that everyone else was wrong about these bricks. The wall collapsed. She started again. Old Marcus Weller watched from the fence line, thumbs hooked in his coveralls. He'd walked over from the crossroads to see what the Furlong girl was doing with the reject pile. "You're fighting them," he said. Nadia didn't look up. "They won't stack straight." "Course they won't. They warped in the kiln. You keep forcing straight brick logic onto crooked brick." He spat. "Thing about fire is, it don't care what you wanted. It does what it does. You either move with it or it beats you." "I don't have time to move with anything. I have time to build something and sell it." Marcus shrugged and turned back toward the road. "Suit yourself. Just remember I said it." She heard him and dismissed him, the way she dismissed most people who told her to slow down. Nadia was 29 and had been alone with her own decisions for 4 years, since her father's tile-setting business had folded and he died 6 months later, leaving her a truck with a bad clutch and the conviction that she was the only person she could depend on. She had grown up on job sites, mixing thin set before she could read, learning the feel of a good joint from the inside of her elbow. She could lay tile, point brick, and read a level with her thumb. What she couldn't do was ask for help, and she considered this a strength. The workshop she rented sat on the edge of Kestrel, a fading brick town in the Pennsylvania hills where the biggest employer had been the Ashbury Firebrick Company for 106 years. She paid $400 a month to a landlord named Denton who reminded her, every month, that he had other people interested. She did small tile jobs, bathroom backsplashes, the occasional patio, and she netted maybe $200 in a good week. The truck's clutch slipped on hills. She kept a coffee can of cash in the wall behind the water heater, and it held, that winter, $1,140. The masonry handbook had been her father's, a water-stained 1974 edition with his pencil notes in the margins. On the page about oven construction, he had underlined one sentence twice. "Curved forms hold heat that flat walls lose." She didn't know why he'd underlined it. He'd never built an oven, but she read that page more than any other. Ashbury Firebrick had closed in October, 11 weeks before this frozen morning, when the parent company that bought it decided the plant was obsolete. 340 people lost their jobs in a town of 2,000. The diner cut its hours. The hardware store started closing Mondays. Marcus Weller, who had tended the tunnel kilns for 40 years, took his pension and started walking the roads because there was nothing else to do with his hands. And behind the plant, under a collapsing pole barn, sat the reject pile. More than 80,000 fire bricks that had failed dimensional inspection over the plant's final decade. They'd warped, bowed, and curved in the kiln, off-spec for the straight, load-bearing industrial linings Ashbury sold to steel mills. Too flawed to sell, too expensive to reprocess, they'd been stacked and forgotten. Now the liquidation company that controlled Ashbury's assets had scheduled them to be crushed into aggregate and buried, because storing them cost money, and burying them cost less. Nadia had learned this the way everyone in Kestrel learned things, at the diner counter, from a man named Petrakis who'd worked the loading dock. 80,000 bricks, curved, free for the crushing. She had gone home and read her father's underlined sentence, and she had thought, "A curve is only a defect if you needed a straight line. She was not a warm person, and she knew it. She had let 3 friendships die since her father's death, because friendships required a softness she'd spent to keep the business alive. She told herself she'd build the softness back later, once she was secure. Later kept moving, but she could see the shape of a thing now. An oven, a dome of curved brick, which the handbook said held heat that flat walls lost. Restaurants paid for wood-fired ovens. She'd priced them, and a real masonry oven ran $10,000 to $20,000 installed. If the bricks were free and her labor was free, the only thing standing between her and that money was knowing how to build one. She was certain the knowing would come easy. That certainty was the flaw she couldn't see. On the second Tuesday of December, a notice went up on the Ashbury gate. Nadia read it in the truck with the heater rattling. The liquidation firm, Corvin Asset Group, had contracted a demolition outfit to begin site clearing on January 15th. All remaining materials, the notice said, would be processed and removed. The reject pile was line item 9, 34 days. She sat with her hands on the wheel. 34 days until 80,000 curved firebricks became gravel under someone's new parking lot. After that, there would be no more free flawed brick anywhere she could reach, because Ashbury had been the only plant in 3 counties and the only one foolish enough to stockpile its failures instead of crushing them as it went. If she wanted those bricks, she had to want them now. She drove to the Corvin field office, a construction trailer with a space heater, and told the site manager she'd haul the entire reject pile away for free, saving them the demolition cost on line item 9. The man, whose name was Ostrander, looked at her like she was a stray dog that had learned to talk. He said he'd have to ask. He said the pile was a liability. He said get it in writing if you're serious, and don't waste my January. She went home and could not sleep, and the not sleeping was the beginning of the debate, because for the first time the size of what she was proposing came clear to her. 80,000 bricks weighed, at roughly 7 pounds each, something near 280 tons. Her truck carried maybe a ton per trip on a good day with the clutch behaving. Even if she only wanted a few hundred bricks to start, she'd have to haul them, and hauling meant fuel, and fuel meant the coffee can, and the coffee can was already thin, and she had no oven design she trusted, only a page in a dead man's book. The next morning she did what she always did with fear, which was to convert it into a list. She priced things, a load of mortar mix, a used cement mixer she found for $140 on a classifieds board, firewood, which she'd need cured and dry, a steel door, or the makings of one. The numbers ate her 1,100 alive, and she hadn't sold a single loaf of nothing yet. She drove out to look at the pile itself. Under the pole barn, the bricks rose in leaning stacks 8 feet high, dusted with snow that had blown through the open sides. She pulled one out and turned it in her hands. It was pale straw yellow, dense, and it curved along its length like a book left in the sun. High alumina fire brick, the good stuff, rated for something like 3,000 degrees, flawed only in shape. She stacked 6 of them and saw immediately how the curves, if you chose them, could be arranged to lean inward, each brick's belly helping the next, a dome wanting to happen. Her father's sentence sat in her chest like a coal, but wanting a thing to work was not the same as knowing it would, and she felt the gap and hated it. She went to the library in the county seat and read what she could find about masonry ovens, wood-fired bread ovens, the black ovens of old European bakeries. She learned the vocabulary, the hearth, the dome, the flue, the thermal mass that soaked up fire and gave it back slow for hours after the flames died. She learned that the dome shape wasn't decoration. It reflected radiant heat back down onto whatever baked below, and it let hot gases roll along the ceiling and out the flue in a lazy circle that cooked the top of a loaf as evenly as the bottom. The curve was the whole point. Flat-walled ovens fought physics. Domed ovens used it. This confirmed everything she believed, and she let it make her overconfident. What she read less carefully was the part about mortar. The books mentioned it in passing: refractory mortar, high-temperature mortar, and she assumed the bagged commercial stuff from the masonry supply would do, because it said high heat on the label, and she was a tile setter and she knew mortar. She'd spent her whole life not asking the question that mattered here, which was whether a mortar made for straight modern brick would behave the same among curved century-old fire brick under a live fire. She didn't ask it. Asking it would have meant admitting she didn't already know. She went back to Ostrander and got it in writing. Corvin would let her remove the reject pile at her own cost and risk, releasing them from disposal on line item 9, provided she cleared it before January 15th, or forfeited any claim. She signed. She had the bricks. She had 31 days. Her hands shook a little when she got back in the truck, and she told herself it was the cold. That night, Marcus Weller's words came back to her. "You're fighting them." And she pushed the memory away because she had no time to move slowly with anything. She had a design, free material, and a deadline. She would build the oven, fire it, bake bread, and put a photograph in front of a restaurant, and the money would follow. It was, she thought, simple. The only people who found it complicated were people who'd never done real work with their hands. She knew she was one of those people about ovens specifically. She chose not to know it. She committed on a Thursday. She drove to the masonry supply in the county seat and spent $290, a third of everything, on 8 bags of commercial refractory mortar, a bag of insulating material, and a used trowel set she didn't need but bought anyway because buying tools felt like progress. She bought the 140 cement mixer off the classifieds man and loaded it, groaning, into the truck. Then she drove to Ashbury and, over 3 slipping clutch trips, hauled her first 400 bricks to the yard behind her workshop. Her plan was clean and wrong in exactly one place. She would build the hearth floor flat, raise a dome of curved brick over a sand form, mortar it all with the commercial refractory she'd bought, cure it a few days, and fire it. She'd seen the shape in her hands. She had the handbook page. She had her whole life of knowing how mortar and brick went together. She did not know that the mortar and these bricks would not agree. She would learn it in front of witnesses. Marcus Weller kept walking past. That was how it started. Him on the road, her in the yard, a nod that became a sentence that became him leaning on the fence with coffee she hadn't offered. He was 71 and widowed, and the plant closing had taken more than his job. It had taken the place where he'd been someone. 40 years he'd read the tunnel kilns by the color of the flame and the smell of the flue, knowing when a batch would warp before the pyrometers did. Now he read nothing. His daughter in Ohio wanted him to move in, and he'd rather die on his feet in Kestrel. He didn't offer to help Nadia. He watched and asked small barbed questions, and she answered short because she didn't want to teach her. But something in the way she stacked the curves, choosing them, matching belly to belly, made him stay a minute longer each day. She was doing something with his failed bricks that the plant never had. Neither of them said any of this. They just kept meeting at the fence. The first real work was the hearth, and here Nadia was genuinely good, and it showed. She poured a small reinforced pad behind the workshop, leveling it with a care her father would have recognized, and on it, she built up a base of solid brick to raise the cooking floor to waist height. She laid the hearth itself from the flattest rejects she could cull, spending an afternoon sorting the pile brick by brick, tapping each with her knuckle and listening. The dense ones rang, The ones with hidden cracks thudded, and she set those aside for grinding into fill, not knowing yet how important that instinct would become. She got the hearth dead level and tight-jointed, the curved bricks trimmed with a diamond blade on her father's old angle grinder until they kissed. She stood back, and it was beautiful. A pale gold floor smooth enough to slide a peel across, and for a moment, the whole thing felt inevitable. Then came the dome, and the dome was where her cleverness earned its keep. She built a form from wet sand, mounding it into a smooth hemisphere the size of the oven's interior, patting it firm. Over this she would lay the curved brick, each one leaning inward against the sand, mortar between, until the ring closed at the top and the sand could be dug out from the mouth, leaving the brick standing on itself. The curves that made the bricks worthless for straight walls made this almost easy. She chose bricks whose bend matched the dome's radius, and they lay down against the sand like they'd been waiting 100 years to be asked. Marcus watched this from the fence and said nothing for a long time. Then, huh, what? Nothing. You picked the right curve for the ring. Most people'd fight it. She didn't tell him it was the second time he'd said she fought things. She mixed her commercial refractory mortar in a bucket, following the bag, and buttered the bricks and set them, course by rising course, 3 courses the first day before the light went. The mortar was gray and stiff, and it gripped hard, and she liked how hard it gripped. She took its stiffness for strength. That was the error, sitting quietly in the joints, waiting for heat. That night she ran the numbers by lamplight. The mortar was going faster than she'd planned. She'd need 2 more bags, $40 she didn't want to spend. The coffee can held 610. She wrote the number down and stared at it. She had cured mortar to wait on, a truck that needed fuel, and firewood to source. She wrote firewood and underlined it and drove the next morning to a man selling seasoned oak by the cord. The oak was $200 a cord, and she needed at least half a cord to fire and cure an oven properly. So she paid $100 for a rick and told herself it would do. It would not do, but she didn't know that either. She hauled it back, split what needed splitting, and stacked it under a tarp against the workshop wall where it would stay dry. Every day now was the same rhythm, and she loved it. Actually loved it. The first joy she'd felt since her father died. Haul, sort, mix, lay, dig, level. The dome rose over the sand mound. Marcus started arriving earlier. He never touched a brick, but he'd say things. "Your mortar joints are wide." And she'd say, "The bricks are irregular. I need the room." And he'd nod like she'd told him something instead of the other way around. By the 9th day, the dome had closed. She set the final keystone brick, a curved one trimmed to a wedge, and tapped it home, and the whole hemisphere held itself up over the sand. She reached into the oven mouth and began digging the sand out by the bucketful, and with each bucket the dome stood freer, until it stood on nothing but its own leaning geometry, a pale gold vault 2.5 feet across. She crawled half inside it and looked up at the curve of it and felt something close to reverence. She built the mouth and the flue from more cold brick, framing an arched opening at the front, with a smaller arch just outside it to draw the smoke up and away. She'd read that the flue had to sit at the front of the dome, not the top, so the mouth pulled fresh air in low and pushed hot gas out high, rolling the heat around the interior. She got the proportions from the library book, the door opening about 60% the height of the dome, and when she stood back, the thing looked like it had grown there. Word had gotten around, the way everything did in Kestrel. The Furlong girl was building an oven out of the reject bricks. A few people drove by slow. Petrakis from the diner stopped and looked and said it was a handsome pile of failure, and she laughed because she was too happy to be stung. She wrapped the outside of the dome in the insulating blanket she'd bought, and then a rough shell of more brick and mortar, a second skin to hold the heat in, and by the 14th day, the oven was, to her eye, finished. It had cost her, in cash, most of what she'd had. The coffee can was down to $320, but it was finished, and it was hers, and she had built it from things a company had thrown away. She let it cure 4 days, keeping small warming fires in it, as the book said, driving out the construction moisture slowly. The little fires behaved. Steam wept from the joints and dried. The dome held. Her confidence, already high, went higher, because nothing had gone wrong, and she believed nothing going wrong was proof she'd been right all along. She decided to hold a first real firing and to invite people, which was, in retrospect, pride dressed as marketing. If it worked in front of witnesses, the story would spread faster. She told Petrakis, who told the diner, and word went out that on Saturday, the furlong girl would fire her brick oven and bake bread, and anyone could come watch. She invited the 2 people in Kestrel who baked seriously, the Hollis sisters, who ran a small bakery 2 towns over and knew wood ovens, and who had said, when they heard, that they'd believe it when they tasted it. She wanted them there. She wanted, badly, to be believed. Marcus, at the fence, heard her plans and frowned. You cured it slow? 4 days, small fires, just like the book. Small fires ain't a full firing. You put a real fire in green mortar. It's not green, it's cured. He looked at the oven a long moment. That mortar you used, what is it? Refractory, high heat, from the supply. For what brick? She didn't answer, because she didn't know, and the not knowing angered her, and the anger made her stubborn. It says high heat on the bag, Marcus. He nodded slowly, the way he did, and said nothing more, and she took his silence for a lack of argument, instead of what it was, which was a man deciding not to waste his breath on someone who wasn't ready to hear. Saturday came cold and bright. 15 or 20 people drifted into the yard by mid-morning. Diner regulars, a few laid-off Ashbury men, the Hollis sisters in their good coats standing a little apart. Nadia had dough-proofing under cloths on a table, made the night before from a recipe she'd practiced in her kitchen oven all week. A simple lean bread, flour, water, salt, wild yeast she'd been feeding in a jar for a month. She could bake. That was never in question. The question was the oven. She lit the fire small, in the center of the hearth, and fed it slowly, and for the first hour everything was perfect. The oak caught and burned clean, and the flames licked up the inside of the dome and rolled toward the flue exactly as they should, the smoke pulling out the front chimney in a smooth ribbon. The interior brick began to darken with soot, and then, as it got hotter, to clear again, the soot burning off from the top down, the oven turning white, that the book said meant it had reached bread heat. People murmured. It was working. Marcus stood at the fence with his arms crossed and did not smile. Nadia moved the fire to one side of the hearth to open floor for baking, raked the coals, and swabbed the brick with a wet cloth on a stick. The floor hissed. She was flushed, triumphant, narrating to the crowd like her father used to narrate a tile job, and the Hollis sisters had come closer despite themselves, because the oven was clearly, undeniably hot, and hot was the hard part. Then the sound came. It was small at first, a tick, then a sharper crack, like a knuckle, from inside the dome. Nadia heard it, and her stomach dropped even before she understood, because a hand that has laid 1,000 joints knows the sound of a joint failing. She looked up into the dome. A hairline had opened along a mortar line near the crown, and as she watched, in the space of 3 breaths, it lengthened. What was that? Someone said. Nothing, she said. Settling. It was not settling. The commercial refractory mortar had done exactly what it was made to do, which was set hard and rigid and stay that way. But the old high alumina Firebricks, under a full firing for the first time in their lives, had heated to a temperature the little curing fires never reached, and at that temperature they expanded. Every material expands with heat. The number that matters is the coefficient of thermal expansion, how much it grows per degree. The century-old fire brick and the modern rigid mortar had different coefficients. The brick swelled at one rate, the hardened mortar at another, and where they met, at every joint, they tore at each other. The stiff mortar could not stretch, so it cracked, and the cracks ran joint to joint, and the dome that stood on its own geometry began, joint by joint, to lose the grip that held its leaning bricks in place. Nadia grabbed for the wet swab as if she could cool it, which was the worst thing, because sudden cooling made the stress worse. But she wasn't thinking, she was reacting. The crack at the crown became a gap. A brick near the top shifted with a grinding sound and dropped an inch and hung there, held by its neighbors. "Get back," Marcus said, suddenly at the mouth of the yard, his voice cutting. "All of you, back." The crowd stepped back. The Hollis sisters' faces had gone from interest to pity, which was worse than mockery. Nadia stood frozen in front of her oven with the swab dripping in her hand. The dome did not explode. It was not violent. It was, in a way, worse than violent, because it was slow and total and dignified in its collapse, like a building sitting down. One brick dropped, and its falling pulled the balance from the ring, and the ring above the door opening sagged, and then a whole section of the crown came down into the interior with a soft crashing tumble, and dust and a gout of smoke belched out the mouth, and the fire scattered across the broken hearth. Half the dome stood, half was rubble, the curved bricks she'd chosen so carefully lying in a heap, glowing at their edges. Nobody laughed. That was the thing she'd remember. She'd braced, somewhere in her, for laughter, and instead there was only the awful sympathy of people watching someone lose something. Petrakis said, "Quiet. Ah, kid." The Hollis sisters looked at each other, and the older one, Ruth, said, not unkindly, "The heat got into it too fast. That's a hard way to learn." And then they left, because there was nothing to taste, and they had a bakery to run. The yard emptied. Nadia stood in the smoke. $320, 14 days, and most of her belief lay in a smoking pile, and the deadline to clear the pile hadn't moved. It was still coming. She still owed Corvin a cleared lot by January 15th, and had removed 400 bricks of 80,000. When the last car pulled out, it was just her and Marcus at the fence. "You could have told me," she said, and her voice cracked and she hated that it did. "I did tell you. You didn't ask what you needed to ask." He came through the gate for the first time, walked to the wreck and towed a broken brick, and picked up a piece of the failed gray mortar. He rubbed it between his fingers and it stayed hard, unyielding, a chip of stone. "This here's your killer, not the brick. The brick's fine. The brick did what brick does." He held up the shard. "This can't move. Your brick moves a hair when it's hot. Every joint, all around the dome. This won't move with it. So it lets go." He dropped it. Rigid mortar, off-spec brick, full fire, was always going to come down. First real heat. So it's ruined. The mortar's ruined. The bricks are mostly fine. They've seen worse than this in the kiln. Clean 'em off. You use 'em again. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his weathered face shifted, some decision. "You did the shape right." "Better and right. I watched you pick those curves. Nobody at the plant in 40 years thought to do anything but throw 'em out." He wiped his hands on his coveralls. "The shape was the hard part, And you got it. The mortar's the part I know. She looked at him. Asking was the thing she couldn't do. Her whole life was built on not doing it. I don't have money to pay you, she said, which was not asking, but was close. Did I say pay? He looked out at the reject pile in the distance under its collapsing barn. I spent 40 years making brick nobody wanted. I'd like to see some of it stand up before I'm done. That was the turn, and it turned everything. Because until that moment, Nadia had believed the collapse was the end, and instead, it was the door. Marcus told her, standing in the smoke. The thing that reframed the whole project, the plant, in its early decades, before it bought commercial mortars, had set its own kiln brick with a mortar the old masons mixed on site from fire clay, sand, and ground brick grog, and that mortar had moved with the brick because it was. The brick, near enough, the same materials, the same expansion. That was why the century-old kiln lining still stood while her 2-week dome lay in pieces. You don't buy the answer, he said. You grind it. Take your broke bricks, the cracked ones, the rubble right there. Grind 'em to dust. That dust plus clay plus sand plus a little wood ash, mixed right, moves like the brick moves, because it's kin to it. Nadia looked at the pile of her failure, the broken bricks she'd have to throw away, and understood that they were not waste. They were the mortar. The answer had been in the rubble the whole time. She could not go back to being the person who thought she already knew. The next weeks pressed her from every side at once, and the pressure was not dramatic so much as relentless, the slow arithmetic of a thing costing more than you have. The recipe for the mortar was not a recipe you looked up. It was a feel, and Marcus had it in his hands but not in words, and getting it out of him was its own labor. They started with the grinding. Nadia's angle grinder could break bricks but couldn't reduce them to the fine grog Marcus wanted, so they built a crusher of sorts, an old cast iron pipe, and a tamping bar, and she spent hours pounding broken fire brick into gravel, and then the gravel into grit, and the grit into powder, her shoulders burning, dust caking in her throat, until she rigged a wet bandana. Marcus watched the color of the dust. Finer. It's gotta pack in tight against the grog. Big pieces leave gaps, and gaps are where the crack starts. The clay came from the creek bank at the back of the property, a gray plastic clay. Marcus judged by squeezing a rope of it and bending it to see if it cracked. That'll do. Ashbury dug clay 1/2 mile from here for 60 years. Same seam probably. The sand she bought, washed masonry sand, $40 she counted out from a coffee can that now held 230. The wood ash came free from her own fires. Then the real work, which was proportion, and here the story stopped being about certainty and became about testing, because neither of them knew the exact ratio, and the only way to find it was to make it wrong many times. They mixed small batches, a coffee can at a time, and Marcus called out rough parts. So much grog, so much clay, so much sand, a handful of ash, and they'd trowel each batch into a test joint between 2 scrap fire bricks, let it dry a day, then heat it hard with a propane torch to see if it cracked, crumbled, or held. The first batch, clay heavy, cracked as it dried, before it ever saw fire. Too much clay shrank too much. The second, sand heavy, never bonded. It powdered off under a thumbnail. The third held the dry but crumbled under the torch. Each failure was information. And Nadia, who had spent her life treating failure as verdict, learned slowly to treat it as data, to write down each proportion in the margins of her father's handbook, on the very page he'd underlined, building a record in her own hand beneath his. Meanwhile, the deadline came on. She could not spend all her time on mortar. She owed Corvin a cleared lot, and 80,000 bricks would not move themselves. She began hauling in earnest, Dawn trips to Ashbury, the truck's clutch slipping worse in the cold, a ton at a time, to a growing stack in her own yard, because she'd decided she'd rather store them than lose them, even the ones she'd never use. Ostrander at the site office reminded her every week, the 15th, or you forfeit, and we crush what's left, and don't think we won't. Then the county came. A code officer named Halloran drove out, having heard, as everyone heard everything, about the oven and the crowd and the fire. He walked the yard with a clipboard and told her what she'd half known and half ignored. She was operating without permits, a commercial oven, a structure with a chimney, fires drawing spectators, on a rented lot not zoned for it. He wasn't cruel about it. He was procedural, which was worse, because you can't argue with procedure. He cited the setback from the property line, the lack of a mechanical permit for the flue, the question of whether she even had the landlord's consent for a permanent structure. She did not have the landlord's consent. Denton, when she called him, was exactly as she'd feared. He had other people interested. He didn't want liability, and a brick oven with the county already sniffing around was liability. He gave her until the end of the month to remove the structure, or he'd start eviction, and he said it in the same bored voice he used about the rent. So now the clocks stacked up against each other, which was the truest kind of pressure. January 15th, to clear Corvin's pile, end of the month to satisfy Denton or lose her workshop, and Halloran's citations to answer, and $230 in the can, and a mortar that still cracked under the torch. Nadia's flaw did what flaws do under pressure. It came back stronger. The old instinct that she alone was responsible, that asking was weakness, that she had to move fast and hard, reasserted itself, and it made her worse to be around, and worse at the work. As she started grinding brick past midnight, refusing to let Marcus's slower pace set the tempo, and she mixed a batch alone one night, guessing at the proportions, wanting to leap ahead to the answer, and she troweled up a whole test panel of it, and torched it, and it held better than anything yet, and she was elated, and she called Marcus the next morning, already talking about rebuilding the dome that week. "Show me the batch," he said. She'd guessed. She hadn't measured. She couldn't tell him the proportion, because in her hurry, she hadn't written it down. She'd just thrown it together by feel, chasing the result, the one panel held, but she couldn't reproduce it. And a mortar you can't reproduce is a mortar you don't have. Marcus set down his coffee. "You're doing it again. The thing that put your dome on the ground." He wasn't angry. He was tired, and the tiredness landed harder than anger. You want the answer so bad you won't do the counting that gets you there twice. One good batch you can't make again is worth nothing. It's worse than nothing, because you'll trust it. I don't have time to count, Marcus. I have the county and Denton and 11 days. Then you'll have all of it fast and none of it standing. He picked up his coffee and walked to the gate. I told you at the start, you move with it or it beats you. You still think you can beat it by going faster. He stopped at the gate. I've watched people rush green work my whole life. It always comes down. Every time. There's no hurrying heat and there's no hurrying clay. He left. She stood in the cold yard with her one irreproducible triumph and understood, dimly, that he was right and hated it and kept working anyway, alone, because stopping felt like dying. She rebuilt the hearth over the next 3 days, salvaging the good bricks from the collapse, cleaning old mortar off each one, which was slow and made her hands bleed at the knuckles. She sorted and stacked and did the parts she was good at, the level, the joints, and avoided the mortar problem because it was the part she couldn't muscle through. She hauled more bricks from Ashbury against the deadline, and the clutch finally began to slip so badly on the plant road that she had to nurse the truck home in second gear, and she knew the repair would cost more than she had. and she added it to the pile of things she was choosing not to look at. Denton called again. Halloran mailed a formal notice, a compliance date, a fine schedule if she ignored it. The Hollis sisters, she heard from Petrakis, had told people the oven came down hard, and the phrase followed her. Came down hard. The whole town's polite verdict. She mixed mortar alone, night after night, and it cracked, or crumbled, or held once and never again, and Marcus did not come to the fence, because she had made it clear with her rushing that she didn't want a teacher, she wanted a shortcut, and he had no shortcut to give. On the 6th night before the Corvin deadline, working past 2 in the morning with the torch, exhausted, she troweled a fresh joint and heated it and watched it split cleanly down the middle, and something in her split with it. She sat down on an overturned bucket in the freezing yard among the broken bricks, and the cold mixer, and the truck she couldn't fix, and the oven she couldn't finish, and she put her dusty hands over her face, and for the first time since her father died, she cried, not prettily, the ugly kind, because everything she'd built her whole identity on, that she needed no one, that hard fast work was enough, that she alone was sufficient, had just cracked down the middle in front of her like the joint. By morning the arithmetic was final. Corvin's deadline was 5 days out, and she'd cleared perhaps 3,000 bricks of 80,000. She would forfeit the rest, and they'd be crushed, and there was nothing she could do about that alone. Denton's eviction date stood. The county fines had started to accrue. The truck sat dead clutched by the workshop. $210 remained in the can, and the mortar, the whole heart of the thing, the reason any of it might have worked, did not work, because she could not make it work by force, and force was the only tool she had ever trusted. She had come to Kestrel's Edge 4 years ago with a truck and a coffee can and the belief that she needed no one, and she had run that belief all the way to its end, and its end was this: a broken oven, a dead truck, an eviction, and a fence with no one leaning on it. The one man who could finish the work had stopped coming, because she had treated his 40 years of knowledge as an obstacle to her speed. She sat in the workshop that afternoon and did not work, which she had never once let herself do, and let the whole thing be lost. She stayed still long enough to think, which was itself something new, because motion had always been how she outran the questions. She thought about her father, who had also believed he needed no one, who had let his business fold rather than take on a partner or ask the bank one more time, who had done it all himself right up until there was nothing left to do it with. She had loved him, and she had built herself in his image, and she saw, sitting there, that his image had a crack in it that ran the whole length of him, the same crack that had just brought down her dome and her year, the belief that needing help was the same as failing. Marcus had told her the truth in the first week, at the fence, before she'd earned the right to hear it. You're fighting them. You either move with it or it beats you. She'd thought he was talking about bricks. He'd been talking about bricks, but the bricks had been talking about her the whole time. The rigid mortar that couldn't move with the brick and so cracked and let everything go, that was her. That had always been her, hard and unyielding and certain, tearing at everything she was joined to until the joints failed. The mortar that worked was the humble one. Ground up failure, common clay, sand, a handful of ash, kin to the brick, willing to move. She understood, finally, that she had wanted to prove she needed no one, and what she needed was the opposite, to be joined to people in a way that could move, that could give a little under heat and not let go. She needed Marcus not as a shortcut but as a partner. She needed the town not as a jury but as neighbors. She had spent 4 years being rigid mortar and calling it strength. The realization did not fix the truck or move the deadline, but it changed what she would do about them, because for the first time she saw that the answer to being alone was not to work harder alone. She got up, in the dark, and walked to the crossroads, and knocked on Marcus Weller's door. He answered in his undershirt, unsurprised, as if he'd been waiting. "I've been doing it wrong," she said. "Not the oven, the whole thing. I've been trying to beat it alone, because I thought asking meant I'd failed. I'm asking. I don't want a shortcut. I want to do it your way. Slow, measured, written down, so it stands up twice. And I can't clear that pile or fix my truck or fight the county by myself, and I'm done pretending I can." Marcus looked at her a long moment. "Took you long enough. Will you help me build it right?" "I'll help you build it right, but not just for you." He stepped out onto the porch. "Half the men who used to run those kilns are sitting in their kitchens going soft. You've got a use for the thing they know. That's worth more than your truck." He almost smiled. "We do it together. We do it careful, and we bring in the ones who can grind and haul and mix. You quit trying to be the only one who matters." "Deal," she said, and put out her dusty hand, and he took it, and it was the first thing she'd built in 4 years that she hadn't built alone. They gathered the resources over the next 2 days, and the gathering was itself the proof that she'd changed, because every piece of it required her to ask. She went first to Petrakis at the diner, not to sell but to ask, and told him the truth. The oven had come down because she'd used the wrong mortar, and she knew now how to make the right one, and she had 5 days to clear a mountain of brick and no way to do it alone. Petrakis put the word out the way he put out everything, and by the next morning 6 laid-off Ashbury men were in her yard, men who'd tended kilns and driven the plant's forklifts and knew Firebrick in their hands. Marcus vouched for the work. 2 of them brought their own trucks. One, a mechanic named Coyle, looked at her slipping clutch and said he could get it holding for a case of beer and the cost of the part, which she promised, and he had it hauling by noon. With 3 trucks and 8 backs, the Corvin pile began to move at a rate one woman and a bad clutch never could. They didn't clear all 80,000. That was never possible in 5 days. But Nadia went to Ostrander and renegotiated from a position she'd never had before, which was competence with a crew behind her. She offered to clear the accessible pile and leave the collapsed barn's buried stacks, and take formal release of what she'd hauled, and Ostrander, who mainly wanted the line item gone and the liability off his books, signed it. She saved perhaps 20,000 bricks, hauled to her yard and to a leased corner of a neighbor's barn. Not all of them. Enough for years of ovens. Enough. While the men hauled, Marcus and Nadia did the slow work, the real work, and did it right. They ground brick to grog, and measured it now, by the coffee can, writing every proportion down. They tested joint after joint, torching each, and Marcus taught her to read the fracture, to see in a crack whether the clay was too rich or the grog too coarse. Batch after batch, until the day a joint came out of the torch's heat, and cooled and held, and Marcus troweled up a second batch to the same written proportion, and it held too, and a third, and it held, and they had it. Roughly 3 parts fine brick grog, 2 parts creek clay, 2 parts washed sand, and a half part wood ash, mixed to a stiff plaster, a mortar ground from the plant's own failures that expanded and contracted with the old fire brick because it was made of the old fire brick. Then they addressed the county, because Nadia had learned that you did not go around procedure, you went through it. She called Halloran and asked what compliance actually required, and it turned out to be less impossible than her fear had made it. A proper setback, which she could meet by rebuilding the oven 3 feet over on the pad, a mechanical permit for the flue, which cost money and paperwork but was gettable, and the landlord's consent. For the landlord she had, now, an argument she hadn't had before. She went to Denton, not as a tenant begging, But as a business proposing, she showed him the written mortar formula, the crew, the renegotiated brick supply, the interest already stirring. She offered him a small share of the oven business in exchange for consent to build permanently and a year's lease locked in. Denton, who cared about exactly one thing, saw a stream of money where he'd seen a liability, and he signed. And with a signed lease in hand, the mechanical permit went through, and Halloran closed his file. Then they rebuilt the oven, and this time it was many hands. Nadia laid the hearth and the dome, because that was her craft and it was superb. The men mixed and ground and hauled under Marcus's eye, and the whole thing went up over the sand form again, but jointed now with the flexible grog mortar. Every course measured, cured slow over a full week of small patient fires that no one rushed. The final firing was the true test, and this was the complication, because a first full firing had brought the first dome down, and everyone in that yard knew it. Nadia had faced her fear of failure, but this was the fear made physical. The same fire, the same heat, the moment the mortar had cracked before. If it came down again, it came down in front of the same town, and there would be no third try, no money, no year left in her. She lit the fire small and fed it slow, and the hours passed, and the dome darkened, and then cleared as the soot burned off, and the brick turned white with heat, hotter now than the first dome had ever reached, past the temperature that had torn the rigid mortar apart. And near the crown, at the exact hour the first dome had begun to tick and crack, Nadia stood beneath the vault and listened. Here was the final choice, and it was not dramatic in the way she'd once have made it. Her old self would have grabbed the wet swab and fought the heat, tried to control it, forced it. Her old self had done exactly that and helped bring the dome down. Now she stood still. She let the fire climb. She trusted the mortar to move, to give the hair's width the brick needed, to be kin to it and not fight it. She kept her hands at her sides and let the heat do what heat does. It was the hardest thing she had done in the whole year, to not intervene, to trust the joined thing to hold because it could move. The dome ticked once and held. The mortar breathed with the brick and did not let go. The oven came to full heat, white and even, and stood. Nadia raked the fire to one side, swabbed the floor, and slid in the loaves she and the Hollis sisters had proofed that morning, because she'd asked the sisters too, and they'd come, curious, to see the rebuild. The bread baked in the domed heat exactly as the physics promised, radiant heat reflecting down from the curved crown, the loaves rising and coloring evenly, and it came out with a crust that snapped and a crumb that was tender and open, a bread the metal ovens 2 towns over could not make. Ruth Hollis broke a loaf and tasted and was quiet a moment and said, "Well, that came up right," and in Kestrel that was the highest praise there was. The oven held its heat through the night on a single firing, still warm enough at dawn to roast in. The thermal mass of all that dense flawed brick giving back its stored fire slowly, using a fraction of the wood a lesser oven would burn. That was the thing chefs would pay for. That was the thing that worked. A year and change later, Nadia knelt in the yard, stacking curved fire bricks into a low ring that went somewhere now, the base of a 4th oven, one of the 3 they had orders for that season. The gutter was fixed. The truck ran. Beside her a young man named Dellen, one of 2 apprentices she was training, held a brick out and asked which curve went where, and she took it, turned it in her hands, and showed him how to read the bend and let it lean into its neighbor. "You don't fight it," she said. "You find the curve that wants to go there." Marcus sat in a chair by the workshop wall, too old now for hauling, but not for watching, calling out when a joint looked rushed. The written formula hung framed inside, in her father's handbook, in her own hand beneath his underlined line. Behind them, the first oven glowed, warming for a restaurant's install the next week, one of the many that had asked that would wait a year for a thing built from what a company had thrown away. She wedged the brick home. It sat flush. This time, she was not building alone.